Thank you very much for that most kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here on this sunny day in Santiago. One of the things that to me is quite significant is that this conversation we're having today with representatives from across Latin America is a conversation that is going on in governments and in public service organizations across the world right now. Just 2 days ago, I was in Los Angeles at something called City Lab. And City Lab was hosted by the mayor of Los Angeles and organized by the former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg. And about 400 people was meeting in LA to discuss the future of cities and innovation in public policies to make a difference for citizens in our cities, large and small. And as some of you may have experienced this morning, one of the challenges in cities is, for example, congestion and traffic. I can tell you that's also a challenge in Los Angeles. And so everyone is discussing what are the ways in which we find smarter, better solutions that will make a difference in people's lives, whether it's here, across this continent, whether it's North America, and whether it's in Europe. And what I'd like to share with you today is just our experience at MindLab, which is the Danish government's innovation team, and a few sort of broader maybe reflections on what's happening right now. And also look very much forward to hearing your comments and your questions, your reflections of what you've heard. So I hope we'll have quite a bit of time for questions and answers later. Let's see. So, the discussion on the public and its problems is not new. As you can see, this quote is actually quite old, from the American philosopher and pragmatist John Dewey. But I think it's a significant quote because it reminds us that the kinds of problems and challenges we're looking at cannot be solved by our public institutions alone. Not by a single institution, but also not without engaging other parts of society, other institutions, the private sector, and first and foremost, citizens themselves. And even though it sounds incredibly simple and obvious, the ability to, in a meaningful way, engage with citizens and enterprises and understand their world is something we're just now beginning to discover in the public policy environment. So to a lot of public managers, and this is the case whether we are in the Nordic countries, whether we are across Europe, or we are in other countries around the world, managing seems a little bit like being in the middle of a perfect storm. Management feels as if we have to deal with pressures coming from a number of different fronts at the same time. So, for example, a number of countries are seeing shifts in demography, both new patterns of immigration and mobility. Many countries are experiencing an aging population. We are experiencing new and different expectations from citizens to government. I heard someone here in Chile recently mention that when Chile joined the OECD, it was celebrated as a good thing to join the rich countries club. But the bad thing is that suddenly you're benchmarking against some of the best in the world, which means you're not necessarily at the top of the table every time. And so that drives up expectations from citizens to say, why are we not doing as well as Germany or as the United States or as well as Norway on certain issues. We're also seeing a shift in technology. Most of you will probably have a mobile device in your pockets. What does that mean in terms of how governments can deliver or create services that people can access easily? How does that drive the cost up of what government should be doing? The technology offers significant ways of reducing costs, but also offers, of course, opportunities that citizens would expect. Let's say, for example, in healthcare. And citizens can rightly ask governments, why is it that I do not have access to the absolutely best available technology when I am entered into a hospital? And that's finally part of the perfect storm that managers and public servants across the world are facing is that in many countries we have been facing a financial crisis over the last few years, and that is a crisis that does not seem to totally let go, not even here in 2014. So the backdrop to this perfect storm is also that we need to do what we're doing with fewer resources, at least in a lot of countries. And even those countries that are able to invest may find that their investments are not catching up to the demands. So this is what our approach to solving those problems look like. We have inherited a legacy where public servants and policymakers work in siloed domains. They work inside agencies, units, departments. They write a lot of memos and reports and analysis. Sometimes it feels like the analysis is the point itself. Good, well-educated public servants coming out of university are used to getting credit for writing very nice and long papers and reports and theses, and a lot of them continue doing so in government. At one point at MindLab, we interviewed a policymaker in the Ministry of Employment, and she's sitting late at night writing another memo, and she looks across the street at the window of a building next door. That's the Ministry of Social Affairs. And she sits there looking over the window and thinks to herself, I wonder what memo they're writing over there. And I'm wondering whether that is also not going to make any difference at all for any citizen. So the question is, our legacy of working in silos, our legacy of focusing more on analysis and less on action, our legacy of building public institutions on the basis of backgrounds and professions in economics and law and political science, whether there's something there we need to look at, and whether there's something that is not working. And maybe that is part of the reason we are falling behind and are not dealing proactively with the perfect storm. In the United Kingdom, the recent government realized that part of the challenge probably is that we're not opening up our policy processes to the world outside of government. And so in the quite significant blueprint for civil service reform from 2012, this is one of the key quotes. And I would say, and I will get back to defining public sector innovation, but I would say that what we're speaking about is not just getting creative new ideas. What we're talking about is how do we actually, how are we able to implement new solutions in a way that is effective and actually makes a difference in people's lives we're hoping for. So what does it mean to not draw on narrow views? What does it mean to open up for other kinds of evidence? What does it mean to ensure that we can actually implement policy? So just to sort of cover the basis of why it might be difficult to do this, and many of you are probably already thinking, it sounds easy, or it sounds as if, Christian just thinks this is going to be straightforward. Of course it's not straightforward. Let's take a look at some of the things we're dealing with here. First of all, we're paying a price for the political context in which we work. If you compare innovation in government with innovation in the private sector, private firms have a board of directors which usually wants the best for the company and usually would communicate that the company is doing well and should be doing well. In government, we have a board that's usually split almost 50-50 between the opposition and the ruling party, and where the opposition will say that everything is going very, very badly, and that everything's wrong, and we need to change everything. And the governing parties will probably say that things are going great and we're doing the right things. So we live in an environment as innovators in government that is characterized by political debate, conflicts, confusion, various kinds of communication, also in the media, and that's a turbulent environment to be in. It is, of course, also the legitimate environment in a democracy. So I'm not saying that it is not fundamentally good, but I'm just saying that it's quite difficult to navigate in. I would say that sometimes, as a public manager, you must just realize that you can wish all you want for cross-sector collaboration, but if there's no political will to do so, then you may just have to give up. Another barrier or challenge to innovation is what you might call anti-innovation DNA, which is that the very organizational structure and the processes and the use of modern technology is lacking behind in the many public sector organizations. It would be a hard sell to compare ourselves to, say, a fast technology-driven startup company, or compare ourselves to Google or Facebook or other recognized innovative companies. We can do a lot to change how we're organized and how we run public organizations, but we also must recognize that we do have demands on accountability, on predictability, and there are reasons why we have the types of hierarchies we have, and they may be difficult to get fully away with. At one point, I did a presentation, and a young gentleman in a team of young new talents in Denmark, policymakers, put up his hand and said that he actually worked in an organization that was very innovative, and his ministry was definitely didn't have this anti-innovation DNA. And I asked him, "So which ministry are you from?" And he said, "I'm from the Ministry of Finance." And I would say that in Denmark, the Ministry of Finance, unfortunately, is recognized as probably the least innovative we have. But he was very young, and probably he would get smarter later. In government, we're also often quite afraid of divergence. We're afraid of ideas that may seem or sound unusual or untested. We also have a tendency to dismiss things we have tried before without exploring whether we may have tried them in the wrong way. We often, as the UK government's civil service plan says, are drawing on too narrow a vision of what might be possible. And it's not surprising because we have, usually drawing on quite a narrow set of professions. I mentioned economics and law and political science. We're often not opening up the process of innovation to other stakeholders and inputs. And we're not spending enough time. Often, how governments come up with ideas happens in a very compressed time frames, under political pressure, in small rooms by a few people, and so we do not take the effort and energy, and we don't have the tools and methods to drive a really creative process and opening up the opportunity space with more ideas. A fourth barrier is that we are not particularly good at placing citizens at the center of how we design policies and services. We talk a lot about evidence, we talk a lot about being citizen-centric, but in practice we often have a very internally driven and expert-driven approach to what we do. And so we often lack the tools and the methods to place citizens' lives and the potential impact on citizens' lives at the heart of our processes. And I'll get back to this as a major part of my presentation today. We do not necessarily have the skills and the abilities as public managers to design and run innovation processes. In my country, Denmark, it's only within the recent decade that people have been even educated in project management inside government. Very few have formal educations that in any way equip them to create collaboration, teamwork, and to work systematically with innovation. So we want to conduct the orchestra and get all the different skills and abilities engaged, but we don't necessarily have anyone to conduct the orchestra. We don't have that skill set. And finally, a barrier to innovation in government is that we do not necessarily receive real-time or at least fast feedback on whether we're successful or not. And if innovation is about achieving better results and being more successful than we are today, that's a bit of a problem if we cannot learn from our experience. So the whole field of results-based management and receiving rapid data on actual outcomes is a place where we also have to invest energy and effort. We have to be better at looking at the outside results of our work and have using digital systems, for example, to capture and present quickly information on success. In those countries and cities where one has implemented visual data to track efforts quickly, whether it's Compstat in New York City or elsewhere, that seems to have been quite significant in driving up performance and innovation. But in many countries, including my own, are investing too little time in real-time data that allows them to look forward. I would say we spend maybe 80% of our time, that's the 80-20 rule, we spend 80% of our time looking too much into the past, waiting many years for policy evaluations that will arrive too late for any kind of decision making. So we have a culture where we're looking to the past and analyzing past data. We do not have a culture where we have rapid access to data that will allow us to make future decisions. So what is MindLab? It sounds as if it's a private consultancy perhaps, but in fact MindLab is a fully integrated part of the Danish public sector. I'm a civil servant myself, and so is all my team. And we're about 20 people working in the center of the government district in Copenhagen. MindLab is a creative space, a physical place as well, within a government building. And we work with our owners, and I'll get back to who they are, in order to generate change that can create value for citizens and business and society. And I'll also get back to what do I mean by value. Because in government, obviously, innovation is not about making a profit or creating more value for shareholders or creating more turnover. Innovation is in many ways not about money, it's about something quite different. That doesn't mean we can't learn from how private organizations are doing innovation processes, but we should be careful in thinking that we can learn from the metrics they're using, for example. So here are photos of the four organizations that we are currently working with at MindLab as a part of our fundamental setup and funding. We're funded by a 3-year collaboration agreement that's now been renewed several times between these actors. To the top left is the Ministry of Business and Growth. That ministry is facing a number of challenges, just like I know is the case here in Chile, which is how do we enhance productivity and growth in the private sector in Denmark and drive up innovation, startups, and create more jobs that way. And with that ministry, one of the major projects we're working on right now is Denmark's future as an advanced manufacturing nation. How can we increase our ability to retain manufacturing in a very high-wage country like Denmark and avoid outsourcing everything to low-income countries? How might we make Denmark attractive in the future for investments in manufacturing? What are the skills and competencies needed by workers, and what should companies do, and what are the policy options we should pursue? So that's one example of the challenges that are facing that ministry and where we are deeply engaged in helping them with that. Top right is the Ministry of Employment. That's a ministry that deals with helping unemployed into work and deals with also with people with social challenges and who are very far away from the labor market. That ministry is right now trying to implement a major paradigm shift, saying that we need to meet citizens in a quite open way, working with citizens to look at the options for future jobs, investing in their education, rather than, as we have done so far, threaten them with taking their benefits away if they don't search for, let's say, 4 jobs every week. So a paradigm shift away from compliance and control without losing it totally, into a paradigm where we are much more focused on who is the person and how might we help that person actually matched with a job. And in that reform process, we've actually taken, in many ways, this idea of open policy making and worked with that ministry to create a very open process from the beginning of formulating policy together with stakeholders and citizens all the way through to the realization of actual changes out in local government across Denmark and in the local job centers, and understanding how does a public reform like employment reform become meaningful and useful to frontline workers and to the citizens they're intended to make a difference for. With the red Danish post box is the Department for Education, and in Denmark we have just in August implemented the largest reform of our public school system in a generation. In Denmark, we have about 500,000 children in school, in public schools, and it's vast majority of children are in public schools. But how do we make them attractive and effective at creating learning, also so that our citizens do not choose to send their kids into a private school? And that reform means very changed work patterns for teachers. It means teachers and the pedagogues must work together in new ways. It means new learning styles, using much more physical education and creative classes as well. And it's a longer school day for children. And it's a very, very big shift for teachers and for parents and for children. And how do you then support such a reform to make it work and not create a backlash and protests and reactions from everyone? So that's the challenge that they're working on right now. And of course the major challenge, which is, will this reform actually lead to more learning and more educational achievement for the kids? Or will it just be a policy change that doesn't achieve its results? And finally, the bottom left is the city of Odense. So we have 3 ministries, national ministries, and 1 city government as part of our ownership and part of our partners. And that city we work with that city as a platform for testing and trying out how national policies might work in practice, and for inspiring national policy from what that city is doing. The city is running a major strategic program called New Reality, New Welfare, which means basically they're realizing this perfect storm is hitting us and we need to transform how we run our services. And without any involvement of MindLab, I would say that that city has already demonstrated some very significant changes. For instance, they have been able to increase the effectiveness of programs for homeless people by 50%, at the same time as cutting the cost by 30%. They've been able to enhance the thriving and well-being of older citizens at the same time as reducing the annual cost by 15%. So they are in many ways finding ways of radically reforming public services to do it both at lower cost, but also in ways that are actually more meaningful and better for citizens. I'll give you one example from a case example from elder care later in my presentation. What MindLab does in our work with those ministries has a lot to do with looking at how people actually in real life experience public services. So whenever we are working on a challenge or on a problem, on a policy with our stakeholders, we would almost always venture out, like in this photograph, where my project manager, Jakob, is interviewing a Danish farmer about how that farmer in practice is experiencing public bureaucracy, and how is he experiencing compliance and control from the taxation office, food safety, occupational safety agency, from the Danish Business Authority, and how does that make sense or does not make sense for him. So we never would run a quantitative survey, we would never do a regular normal focus group. What we would do is to go out and take a look for ourselves. And often we would video film or audio record interviews. We would spend time in this farm, for example, looking at files, looking at his systems, looking at ways, at the letters he's receiving from government, discussing with this enterprise what works and what does not work, what's confusing, and basically harvesting insight into what could government do differently. We would often take our colleagues into the field and do this type of study with them. I'll give more examples through my presentation. But I would say that the key to transforming public services must be to begin with what's going on today. How are we doing today? And doing it in a way that's very fine-grained, very detailed, very qualitative, very rich in information. You can't drive innovation by asking questions which you have thought of in your own silo and your best guess about what people will answer. I've conducted many surveys as my time as a management consultant, but I would say that there are some very deep problems with using quantitative surveys to understand the reality, where you need to allow yourself to be surprised. So, public sector innovation is about new ideas that are actually turned into practice and create value for someone. You could also say it's new ideas that work. And of course, a prerequisite for that is some degree of creativity and openness to new ideas, but it's also a lot of hard work in actually implementing. And as I mentioned before, it's also got to do with measuring whether we're actually successful. And also understanding whether there are unintended consequences of our ideas that were good or bad, and that we should maybe means we should adjust what we're doing. So, the question of value. Many of you might be familiar with the whole notion of public value and the work of Mark Moore and others, but just to say that I have proposed, and I suppose I keep proposing, that when we innovate, we should probably look at least 4 different types of value or dimensions of value. First and foremost, outcomes. So what are the changes in educational learning and achievement? What is the changes in health? What are the changes in our environment? What are the changes concretely happening in our effects for people with socially excluded or people with social challenges? In other words, what are the changes in the world for actual people and businesses that we are achieving? That's outcomes. Outcomes are actually the things that we cannot directly pay for or be responsible for, but nonetheless is what we're being held accountable for. If the Danish national school reform does not lead to higher educational achievement for our children, the minister will definitely be asked some questions. If our labor market reforms do not lead to a better match between unemployed citizens and actual jobs and create a more efficient labor market, that minister will definitely be asked some questions. Even though the responsibility for those reforms lies at local government levels to implement them, local institutions and schools or in job centers and so forth. So the tricky and wicked and complex challenge is, how do we achieve outcomes when we do not control the actions of everyone in the system? But that's nonetheless what we have to do. And one way of working systematically with creating outcomes is to look at how are we creating a service experience for people that is meaningful and useful and relevant. And what are the types of behaviors we can enhance through that service interaction. So service experience is first and foremost a way to achieve outcomes and looking at that, but is also, I think, a value in itself. Because the way we treat citizens and the way they experience our hospitals, our schools, our roads, our environment, that is what generates legitimacy of government. One of the reasons why Denmark is able to have a 50% income tax and still have the highest level of trust in government by citizens is probably that they generally are experiencing they're receiving value for their money. If there's a mismatch between what you pay to government and what you perceive and experience you're getting, then you have a problem. So service experience means treating people and understanding how we, in the service processes we are responsible for, people have a meaningful, useful experience, even when we can't give them what they want. So for example, in Denmark, we turn a lot of immigrants away, people who seek asylum or people who want to immigrate to Denmark. We have, of course, like your country, some policies about who we can have and who we cannot have. And it turns out that the satisfaction of those citizens applying for a job permit, for example, can be quite high, even though they get a rejection. If we have explained why, and if they feel they've been listened to and they've been heard, and we've taken them seriously, and then they understand why they're getting a no. So there's not necessarily any link between refusing services or not giving people something on the one hand, and then a positive experience on the other. But that is something that many public organizations fail to understand. The dimension of value is productivity, the ability to drive efficient public services. And of course, that is a major challenge in these times of financial crisis in many countries. But of course, it's not the ultimate reason for the public sector to exist. It's just a condition that we always have to look at ways in which we can leverage our resources better. And so that is, of course, also a part of the public value dimensions. And finally, just to round off, that democracy and improving our democracy, of course, is also a really, really important value of innovation. So we can innovate how people participate in democratic decision-making, how we run our elections, whether they run digitally or physically, for example. We can also innovate the transparency of government by posting documentation and data online. We can give people access to the data and information we have about them, and give them more ownership and of their own information. So there are many, many ways in which we can also innovate really around some democratic principles that we take seriously. What we're seeing, I think, is that not only are we beginning to explore more citizen-centered approaches to innovation, but we're actually also seeing the emergence of a new paradigm of governance. And for you as alumni and scholars of public administration, this may be almost like preaching to the choir. You may be very well aware of this, but so I won't spend too much time on it, but just to say that I think we are seeing the emergence of a new model of how we govern our public institutions, a model that comes on the back of a legacy of Weberian bureaucracy and a legacy of the so-called new public management, which introduced a lot of market-based ideas about how to run the public sector. So I'll say a little bit about that, and then I'll say something quite a bit more about innovation from a citizen perspective. And then in my presentation, I'll just touch on the rise of innovation labs or gov labs. These things have many names, but institutions or organizations a bit like MindLab, which can help make this happen, make both the citizen-centered innovation processes work, but also can help us discover how we actually arrive at a different paradigm of governance. So, in very simple terms, and this is not a new term and it's not something I've invented, co-production is a governance approach where we basically leverage all available resources to create better outcomes. And in fact, I think the starting point is to begin with citizens and their resources, or enterprises, or whoever it is that are end users of a service or of a policy. So let's look at some of the ways in which that's being articulated. So we're seeing this conversation happening in academia, and it has been happening for at least the last 10 or 15 years. We're also seeing it happen in practice. So for example, in Denmark, we last year adopted a new charter for civic engagement in our society. And one of the key points in that charter was to shift from a delivery of resources to people to activating their resources. Voluntary organizations, people themselves, being much more aware of the skills we have in our society. A very interesting consultancy in the UK called Participle has written a very nice piece on relational welfare, and saying that any kind of public service is really about a relationship. We're not in the business of selling soap or washing powder or selling, even for that matter, smartphones. We're in the business of creating long-term change for people in our schools, in our healthcare system, in our social services. That is not a transactional service. It's not like asking citizens or dealing with citizens like they're going to the bank and having a transaction and receiving money, or a shopping transaction. It is something that's about building trust and relationships over time to impact people's lives, whether that is with your doctor or your school teacher or whoever it is. And understanding what that means, I think, is quite significant for how we do design our public institutions. The Danish Regions, which is the association that runs the Danish healthcare system and the Danish hospitals, there's a conversation about the difference between professional quality and experience quality. So what would happen if we actually put citizens or patients' experience of the system at the heart of what we do, and defined good quality healthcare not by professional standards from doctors and nurses only, but also from a standard of patient experience. And finally, the city of Odense that we are working with closely in MindLab is basically saying that citizens probably should not have the rights to a certain service. Citizens should have the right to a certain outcome. And I'll try to illustrate that with a case example in just in a moment. So the model that we have inherited, and that is in our minds usually when we design policies, is this one. We are authorities, and we use services and rules, regulations, and funding to impact society. The model that we're seeing emerge and we're discussing globally now in public management circles is a model that looks more like this, where it's the ability to generate positive outcomes for people and for society, leveraging all the resources we have that is at the center. And this might look simple or easy, but obviously, as many of you can imagine, this is not so easy. And my fundamental point is that we probably will have to discover how to do something like this, for each policy domain, for each institution, for each problem area we're dealing with, because it will look very different from context to context, from nation to nation, region to region, and policy domain to policy domain. So we can have this model in our minds as where we are working, but we probably will have to have a lot of processes with the stakeholders, with the citizens, with the public institutions to find out how is this going to work exactly. And so I think the key point is you can't just top-down implement co-production as a model. You basically have to discover it. So let me give you an example of how co-production might look like in practice. This is a source from Fredericia City, but is also being implemented in many other municipalities in Denmark right now. And especially the city of Odense is in fact leading the way. The manager in charge of the case I'll tell you about now, she's now head of director of elder care and elder services in the city of Odense. So this is a quite unusual picture. It's a citizen, the lady sitting in the chair, who's basically surrounded by public employees from health and social authorities across the city of Fredericia.